RS21 meeting. Today the discussion is on Paris, Ankara, Syria, the bloody cost of imperialism wars. So your wars are dead. It's like a translation of the French resistance to the attacks in Syria and the way in which it's translated into like racism in France and like the rise of fascism. And yeah, so we have like a few speakers who are really good, and they'll be speaking about like varying topics from like France to Syria to Ankara, and so like Jim will begin, and then followed by Miriyam and Phil, and then we'll have a Q&A, and then come back to the speakers, and then another round of Q&A. Okay?
Okay, thanks a lot. A few, about 10 days after the Paris attacks, there was a demonstration in defiance of the state of emergency that resulted in about 200 people being arrested and held in custody for up to 24 hours. And during the course of the demonstration, which took place at the Place de la République, where there was a monument to there's a big statue in the middle of the square, and there were flowers and tributes and candles to the people who died in the appalling attacks in Paris. During the course of the demonstration, the police moved onto the podium around the statue and trampled the candles and the cards and the flowers. And I was going to say it's a metaphor. It's not even really a metaphor, is it? They literally trampled on the memory of the people who died in the attacks. And it's really, that sums up the response of the political establishment to what happened in Paris. The immediate response was to start bombing Syria, to start exacerbating the conditions that have given rise to the situation we know about in the Middle East and the consequences for elsewhere. They also imposed a state of emergency for the first time since the Algerian War. One prefect stipulated the terms of the state of the emergency, a prefect in the Rhone, who said all protests are banned under the terms of the state of emergency. Other public events of a sporting, recreational or cultural nature are not covered by the ban. So if you look at the attacks that were carried out, they targeted a sporting event at the Stade de France, they targeted recreational events in the bars outside in the 10th and the 11th arrondissement of Paris, and they targeted the cultural event, the concert at the Bataclan. So none of these, in terms of protecting the French population, were covered by the state of emergency. And over 2,700 searches or raids have been carried out in the weeks following the attacks. Nearly 300 people have been taken into custody. Over 350 people have been put under house arrest. I think only 2 cases in relation to these raids and searches relate to ongoing terrorism investigations. Other measures include border controls, the threat to withdraw nationality from people holding dual nationality who are convicted of terrorism offences, more armed police on the streets. So a huge increase in the surveillance and the repressive mechanisms at the state's disposal, which many of the measures were actually Front National, part of the Front National programme. Marine Le Pen, the leader of the Front National herself, said she took President Hollande's measures to be a tribute to her. And so it's no surprise really in this climate. I mean, if we think 6 months ago, if the Front National had said, in order to combat terrorism, we need to impose a state of emergency, we need to put people under house arrest who are suspected in any way of terrorism, we need to look into the possibility of detention centres for the thousands of people who are on lists of suspects. We need armed police and soldiers outside schools and nurseries. People would have said, but this is fascism, and yet this is the authoritarian response of the government to the attacks. And so it's no surprise, really, given this context and given the trajectory of politics over, in particular, I would say, the last 10 years, to see that the Front National won its highest ever vote in the regional elections. They won 6.8 million votes in the second round of the elections, and so this beat Marine Le Pen's score of 6.4 million votes in the 2012 elections, and it was a vote that didn't result in any regions being controlled by the FN. They won several hundred regional councillors, more regional councillors than the Socialist Party. But their response to the vote was to say, this proves our point that we are the only opposition to the mainstream. The mainstream has been forced to gang up on the Front National in order to keep us out of office. This is an assault on democracy, and our trajectory is going upwards, and we will carry that trajectory into the 2017 elections. So I just want to say a couple of things really about this general situation and where it's come from, because yes, the attacks were horrific, but the response was very much a similar response, a more hardline response, but in a similar vein to the response to the Charlie Hebdo attacks in January. Increased measures in the realm of surveillance and state, the reinforcement of the state's authority, but also the targeting of France's Muslim population in particular. And that went from kind of right-wing sovereigntist deputies like Philippe de Villiers, who in the wake of the November the 13th attack said, we are paying the price for the Moscotization of France. Alain Juppé, who is a mainstream right-wing politician, supposedly a more moderate statesman-like alternative to Sarkozy as a possible candidate for the mainstream right in the elections, said French Muslims must declare they have nothing to do with this barbarism. Manuel Valls, the socialist prime minister, talked about Islam must break with any complicity with terrorists. No sociological, cultural or social excuses could be found for the attacks. So in other words, let's not try and understand what happened. Let's exacerbate the situation. Let's bomb Syria. Let's increase the repression. Let's ramp up the security measures. And all of this simply plays into the hands of the Front National, which, to be honest, at the turn of the century, although they came second in the 2002 elections and then lost the standoff with Chirac in the second round. They had just at that point come out of a very damaging split. Their vote in 2002 was largely as a result of the collapse of the other parties. Le Pen got a disappointing, the father got a disappointing vote in 2007. What happened between 2007 and 2012 is under Sarkozy, Islamophobia, questions of national identity, overt racism were all legitimised by the government. They set up a ministry of immigration and national identity. Sarkozy made an appalling speech in Dakar where he talked about the benefits of French colonialism, talked about the problem with the African man as he's never entered into history, lives a life rhythmed by the seasons. They tried to rehabilitate notions of French colonialism. And all of this reinforced the Front National under Marine Le Pen, who has this, people have read about the so-called de-diabolisation or sanitisation strategy, which they have, which really amounts to not being overtly anti-Semitic. And the media and the rest of the mainstream lap this up and say, oh yes, they've changed, we can't call them fascist, because they're not overtly anti-Semitic. Although polls show that the majority of their members hold anti-Semitic views and that they are a vehemently Islamophobic organisation. The danger, the threat posed by the Front National is its capacity for radicalisation, its capacity to be something other than simply a racist authoritarian party, the capacity to radicalise in a way that we would say is akin to fascist organisations of the 1930s, to develop, in other words, not talking about 400,000 stormtroopers, but we're talking about a capacity to organise on the streets and to mobilise against their opponents. So one mayor in Béziers, Robert Ménard, a new Front National mayor under the state of emergency, announced that he was going to attempt to set up a volunteer force because the police alone wouldn't be able to implement the state of emergency measures. So he was appealing to ex-service people and anybody else who wanted to be part of this volunteer force to help the local and national police. So this is a mayor who previously had put up posters all around his town of revolvers, 7.65mm handguns, saying, your local police have a new friend. So that's the kind of culture that exists behind the supposedly respectable veneer of the organisation. And the other thing that has changed, I'll just end on this, is that what the Front National has done is it has adapted its rhetoric to pose as the most trenchant defenders of secularism. So when Valls, the Prime Minister, on a day, a celebration of secularism, called on Muslims to vote for the socialists, Marine Le Pen said, this flies in the face of secularism. He's appealing to Muslims as a community. This is communitarianism. It runs counter to the notion of secularism. We appeal to Muslims as individuals to be part of our national rebirth under the... And crucially, what they are arguing is that the Front National is the only force with the authority to get things done. It's the only force that will implement measures, so to get tough on immigration, to get tough on Muslims, to defend secularism. And it's in this way that they present themselves as the defenders of the Republican state against the other mainstream parties. And in the context of a state of emergency, where you have the Prime Minister saying that after 3 months of the state of emergency, we'll look at the possibility of extending it further, then that's a very, very dangerous situation indeed. And therefore, the left and the failure of the left up to now to come behind calls for... Just one last thing I'll say. There was a meeting last Friday couldn't have been organised on a broader basis for peace and social justice. It included many of the organisers of an anti-racist march for dignity a few weeks ago, and a few months ago a march against Islamophobia. No organisation of the radical left put its name behind that meeting. Many of the people on the radical left who were asked about the meeting said, oh, don't blame us, we weren't part of organising it, because they had fears about, I don't know, you know, they felt that they had to justify themselves to racist arguments about why are you on a platform with these controversial Muslim speakers, or in other words, they put their narrow sectarian interests before the interests of the wider movement, which is a real obstacle to building the broad-based campaign that's needed to fight the Islamophobic drift and the authoritarian drift in French society.
Yeah, thanks for having me here. I'm going to try in the short time I have to tackle or to engage with 2 points. First, and there will be obvious overlaps with the previous and the next speaker. First, I will try to say a few words about sort of the roots of the developments, recent developments, or the larger context. And then second, what are the possible answers, or what are strategies in terms of our resistance. And I try to weave within that also questions regarding Syria, because I was asked to comment on that, and I think it's important because it's, I think, a very important debate in the movement and among leftists at the moment. So a lot of what I was saying is thinking out loud or just ranting. I think in terms of the causes and the roots of events like Paris, I think it's interesting that for a change, I actually agree with some of the terms that are used. And the terms mostly used with regards to young, non-white Europeans is radicalization. And I think there's a point. I think there is a problem with radicalization, but in the sense that actually the problem is that we don't have enough radicalization, and that actually that answers some of the questions. And in that sense, I mean, I agree very much with my friend Arun Punani, who wrote a really good piece for Democracy Now!, trying to understand that radicalization in the sense of what the state and neoliberalism and reformism have done in the last 30 years with understandings of political organizing and political identities. In other words, how it has attacked and stigmatized radical politics in terms of anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, anti-racist forms of thinking, organizing, and writing, and that having demolished that partly, it has also removed a context, a vacuum, a way of thinking and organizing, I think, for a lot of our youth. And I think that, so in this sense, it's true that radicalization is a problem because there isn't enough of a certain kind of radicalization that has led to other alternative ideologies and forms of mobilization and recruitment to emerge. So, I mean, also in terms of like Daesh, what this says about the popularity of Daesh. I mean, I have a friend who's doing research in Belgium among Salafi groups and Islamist organizers, and actually she has done this for a long time, and she has always said, like, we need to really be careful in how we talk about Salafis and other groups, because a lot of them are actually meaningless in terms of like the political ramifications. They're just in their own little world, and they have no interest in, they don't do any harm or whatsoever. And there are also some groups who are very susceptible to very anti-Western ways of thinking, and it's very interesting what she observed in Belgium is the same thing I experienced and observed in the Netherlands, in that the orchestrated, almost orchestrated attack, top-down attack on any alternative form of organizing among young, mostly non-white people has created this vacuum. And I think what we see now is a kind of like the ramifications of the same approach that US and Western imperialism have tried in the 60s in the Arab world, where they crushed communist and then Arab nationalist movements because they were a threat to sort of the imperialist hegemonic forces. What happened is that that vacuum led to the rise of reactionary Islamist movements, which were funded by Saudi Arabia, etc. What we see is this kind of similar dynamic writ small. It happens in very small scale dynamics in certain places in the continent. We've seen this literally happening when, after 9/11 and during the second Intifada, when we started organizing and we were under constant surveillance and we were being basically repressed, and it was very hard for people to come out as a radical, anti-war activist or pro-Palestinian activist. It was very hard, and I think in that sense, Netherlands, Germany, Belgium, and France have some similarities also in the context of how all of this is very easily framed as anti-Semitism. So what it does, it pacified a certain generation. It pushed back some of the very interesting initiatives that were starting, for instance, in Belgium and the Netherlands with the Arab European League, and in other countries similar development. So it basically cut off the sort of progressive alternative, if we want to use that dichotomous liberal term. And so basically the lack of an anti-capitalist or anti-imperialist radical politics has revenged itself, you could say. And obviously being in the university and being myself an academic under the repression of Prevent, you almost think twice, but the echoes of sentences we grew up with by Malcolm X of the chicken coming home to roost come to mind, like it's kind of like almost strange that this is not part of ABC pragmatic analysis, and actually I think this is part now of ABC pragmatic analysis, but not of the liberals and the left, but of the right. If you look at the writings now, I actually always advise people to read outlets that are not your political worldview to understand. But if you look at foreign policy, the way they write about, for instance, that crazy man with his toupee, it's really framed in the sense of pragmatic politics. Like, we are very much against this kind of right-wing emergence of people like Trump and others, because actually it's counterproductive of what we're getting. So there's a more pragmatism among the right-wing and reactionary forces than among our own sort of milieus, in understanding that what we've done was wrong, or what we've done actually in decapitating these sort of more moderate, to use another term that is very problematic, that we could potentially co-opt. We of course won't be co-opted, but they think they could potentially co-opt us rather than groups like that. So it's interesting to actually follow that debate, and to see also how the Pentagon is now involved with Donald Trump's outlets and the last week's announcement, and to also see that the British ruling class are sort of making jokes. I mean, their jokes are better than our jokes. I mean, if I hear the mayor of London saying the only risk of me going to London is meeting Donald Trump, I think, I wish we had that kind of left-wing populism in our discourse. So I think that so this lack of anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist alternatives, I think, are part of the roots and causes, and we need to think about how we regain that, how we bring that back, because I think it's clear also when you look at certain anti-racist or decoloniality groups, their weakness also becomes very apparent when they don't also involve this dialectics. Race and class are part of any alternative solution. So if you see in France, I think, with some movement where class is actually not an elementary part of the analysis, actually it still marginalizes a large section of those very youths in the banlieues and elsewhere that can potentially be mobilized. And I think that we have strong evidence that the weakness or the strength of the left has direct ramifications. And I think if you see across the world, you see this very clearly. France and Holland and the United States, where the leftist weekend has been crushed and is going under a very difficult situation, has a very has a very particular response. The rise of Le Pen for a long time, Wilders in the Netherlands, who have set the stage for a lot of people to follow, and Trump in the United States. And what we see is that they rise and they mobilize, they reach a certain popularity, but when, indeed, also I think what you said, when push comes to shove, they will be stopped to a certain extent, because the ruling class can also not deal with sort of this kind of irrational fascist. But the effect is still that what happened in the Netherlands, I think you see this everywhere, is that the algorithms have shifted in the meantime. So the politics of Geert Wilders and the Neo-Nationalist Party have now become the politics of the Labour Party. So I think it's very wrong for us to look at only at election results. But if you look at Britain, and there was a lot of hoo-ha about UKIP and Oldham, and actually you can see that the effect, I think, of the Corbyn campaign and sort of a new sort of reanimation of certain progressive politics has been part of actually stopping UKIP and in Oldham. And there's a kind of like, I don't know, a kind of, how do you call it, common sense that I think is particular in Britain, that is very absent in other countries, where, you know, like this kind of mega million petition against allowing Trump to come to this country, I think is very interesting. And so I think we can also learn from that. So I think what this tells us is there's a polarization. So I don't believe in this sort of either-or analysis. Some of our comrades would like to only have a doom scenario, the left is crushed, or Le Pen is winning, and everything, it doesn't really help. What we need to see is, like, there's a polarization, and what we can do is we can jump into that and create a bigger rift to divide the left from the right. And to go to my second and final point, if I have a few minutes, what does this say in terms of how we strategize and how we think about solutions? And I think there's so much going on, it's hard to follow. Of course, this is related to the burst of ideas and creativity after the Black Lives Matter movement. And we also see that there's a lot of interesting stuff coming out of France in terms of the Parti Indigène de la République, the decolonization movement. But I think that I feel like pressure to pause and to stop and to say, well, despite the popularity of a lot of the issues coming out of terms like white privilege and decoloniality, I think the solution and openings will not be found in framing things that sort of focuses on hating white people or hating white institutes. Especially not when white gets to be conflated with left. And you see that a lot. You see that a lot of people conflate white with left. You leftist, whiteist, whatever. I think only not is it wrong in terms of how it sells millions of leftist people across the world who are not white short, and our own history, strong, proud histories of leftist movement. But I also think strategically it's counterproductive. So my contribution in this debate to my own sort of non-white comrades, and some of the white comrades have completely adopted this idea, by the way, which I find astonishing, who are spending so much time acknowledging their privilege and checking lists, and I don't know what they're doing. I think that we need to counter that and to go back to politics and to say that, you know, one of the things we could do is go to the roots of all of this by, for instance, if we want to have academic activism, which I think white privilege is, I really think white privilege and all that kind of decoloniality is a very academic, elite form of thinking. If you want to be elitist or academic, we could do something about looking at the roots of the sort of backwardness ideas about Muslims and about non-white people in your country, and that is talk about the history of imperialism, talk about the history of racism. I think that this nonsense about, you can actually deconstruct this nonsense about this media hype about going into all out into war. After Paris, going all out into war. First of all, we're already in war. What are you talking about? Also, in terms of, this could be my contribution on the Syria debate, I think a lot of Syrians have a very important point when they say, sorry, they've been bombing, only they called it something else. So when Stop the War says, and now we have to stop the British involvement, the British have already been involved in the last few years, it's just called something else. So we can pause and push back on what this means, all-out war. You've been doing it in the last 3-4 years, it has a different label. So now it's time to listen and to report on what our friends in Syria are saying. We should listen and bring their voice and a critical analysis. The second thing is, when they talk about all out into war, it's been over 200 years war. And that's, I think, what we can do. We can organize meetings where we talk about what did the British and French do in the 1920s. They were experimenting with air bombardments in Syria, and Morocco, and Libya. They were doing the most inhumane carpet bombing you can imagine, which then became the blueprints of military handouts and documents. This was the experience a century ago, and it has been like that non-stop. When they are saying this was the bloodiest events in whatever, ever or something, they said ever, I think, in France. We should bring back 1961. What did people are still looking for some of the bodies that are on the bottom of the Seine of Algerians who were protesting French colonialism. That's a radical form of decolonizing. Decolonization is to reinsert these histories that have resulted in a certain historic amnesia that are partly, I think, internalized by our own Algerian, Moroccan, and non-white France and the leftist movement. And finally, I think we need to acknowledge that we need to remind people around us and acknowledge that history really cuts like a knife. History cuts like a knife. When people see things on television or when they hear about stuff that are similar, they think about Nablus, they think about Fallujah, they think about Abu Ghraib, they think about Homs, and we need to understand that the politics of people who have a certain relation with the region is part of the politics of our movement here. And so that's why you need to also listen and give them a platform and talk and to make these, to connect these dots. So I think in terms of like what can we do in strategies, etc., decolonizing, all for it, but let's decolonize also in terms of this kind of historical lessons that we can bring back as a form of sort of correcting the sort of ultimate white canon of history. Let's talk about how to build unity between black and white, like the movements before us have done in the 60s and 70s. For Christ's sake, that's the reason why they were all assassinated. Why was the Black Panthers assassinated? Because they moved away from a separatist world look and thought about black and white unity is a step forward. I really recommend, by the way, seeing the film that just came out, a documentary, the Black Panther Vanguard Party. Really look at it and you will see how CIA, Hoover and Nixon really had this very conscious agenda of breaking any possible unity between black and white. And I think we are going through this now as well. If I see posters in my university of Prevent saying that we cannot organize certain meetings, I think it's not just surveillance. I think it's also deep down about this fear of what will happen if you see sort of cross-fertilization between these different minority groups and other sort of progressive bodies or university unions. So I think those are things that I'm thinking about out loud, and I might miss a few things here and there. I would like to hear from you later what that is, but I'll leave it at that because I think I spoke to it.
Right, I'm basically going to talk as quickly as I can and give a little bit of an overview of the current situation in Turkey, the lead up to the Ankara bombings, and the current situation and some of the implications for the left. But I want to kick off with a comment that Erdogan used as he was re-elected, winning back the AKP majority in November. Erdogan made a statement and ran on a campaign that said we're under attack from within and without. And it was a campaign for security, and it was a campaign basically to justify relaunching a war in Kurdistan. And that is the starting point, number one. The second point is basically a number, 3,668. Those are the number of people who died in the British Troubles, the so-called British Troubles, since the period the troops went in. 40,000 is the number who died in the war in Turkey, with Kurdistan. That number is 40,000. By the end of this December, since June, 3,000 will have died in Kurdistan. 52 communities are under siege tonight. Syria is being shelled, Diyarbakir is being shelled. There's no stepping around that. There is a reality of war that is going on inside of Turkey that has gone on for almost 40 years. That's the nature of the beast. It is Turkey's island. It has gone on for multiple years, and there is no two ways about it. There's no ducking this question. The second thing I will say is there is a very hypocritical relationship between the West and the AKP, and how the AKP is depicted in power. It is often depicted in ways which I fundamentally disagree with, in basically Islamophobic terms. It is routinely called an Islamist party. Turkey is routinely called an Islamist state. It is not. It is a democratic secular state. It has a democratic secular constitution. And the AKP were elected for a reason. They have a mass base. And they have a mass base for a whole series of very good reasons, which I'm happy to go into. So, firstly, we have to avoid simplifying areas that we have not looked at. And this applies to how Turkey's complex relationship with the Kurdish question and how its relationship with Syria is routinely depicted. So in terms of the facts of the bombings, Ankara was in the news for about a day. Between 103 and 106 people were killed in the Ankara bombings. They came on the heels of the Suruç bombings, in which 33 were killed. They came on the heels of the Diyarbakir bombings, in which 5 were killed and another 40 injured. This was part of a consistent and ongoing set of bombings that took place. At the time, you have to understand the context. When the AKP came to power in 2002, they presided over a period of quite significant, quite rapid economic growth within Turkey. And for many people within Turkey, they provided real concrete material gains. That is undeniable. I'll give you a little bit. In 2003, a year after the AKP came to power, 2003, 0.5% of all state spending went on social services, 0.5%. By 2013, 1.6% went on social services. In that same period, GDP had tripled. Now, what did that actually mean concretely to people on the ground? People predominantly outside of rural areas of southeastern Turkey, but people, most of them Muslims, the base of the AKP, it meant for the first time somebody could go into the American hospital. Prior to that, that was basically an extremely expensive private hospital where basically the poor could not get treatment. You were not allowed in. This is the leading hospital in Istanbul. It meant reductions in tuition fees and actually free places. So there's a whole series of progressive moves that the AKP brought in. The most progressive of which was attempting to open up peace talks with the Kurdish leadership. With Öcalan, who's in jail, has been in jail for many years. They opened up secret talks with Öcalan to attempt to open up an island-like solution, or any type solution. Actually, they did look to the Irish peace process. They brought over a series of people who've been involved in the negotiations around Ireland. They were looking to actually quietly attempt to come up with the bones of a peace settlement. But other things were going on at the same time. Other things were going on both within the AKP, but also within the Turkish economy. They presided over a period of extremely rapid growth. They were extremely lucky. There was a lot of hot money flowing into Turkey. A lot of it also to do with mineral development on the borders and the development of 2 new major pipelines. Growth rates were coming in at between 9% and at certain quarters 12.4% a year. So the Turkish government was able to deliver a certain degree of real material benefit to people, and you saw that in terms of a lot of the infrastructure that was developed. At the same time, over a period of time, what you saw increasingly was probably one of the most significant moves that was made by the AKP government was actually dealing with the military. For the first time, a whole slew of the military leadership were jailed. They were jailed, others were put under house arrest. There was a wholesale cleaning of the top layer of the military. And why did this matter? Because there had been 3 military coups between 1960 and the end of the 80s. 3 major military coups with enormous implications, which had ramifications right across Turkish politics, to the stage where it decimated large sections of the left. The Islamist Welfare Party, which is one of the precursors to what became the AKP, were effectively banned. You had 55 people executed, you had 586 people given the death sentence, you had 36,000 people lost their jobs, 3,000 teachers were stripped from their jobs. It was a period of utter repression, where the left and Islamists were paraded on TV to confess. The AKP challenged that, and they actually challenged the head of the military. What happened when the knowledge came out that they were engaged in talks with the Kurdish opposition? In the context of three things. Firstly, the handling of the Gezi Park protests. The Gezi Park protests, people familiar with the Gezi Park protests that you may have seen on TV from Istanbul. It's a tiny little park. It's no bigger than Chestnuts Park near my house. It's like one of the last remaining pieces of green space in Istanbul. It hasn't been paved over. That protest started with 50 people. What was it about? It was about the construction of a new shopping mall on the only major park left in the centre of Istanbul. Why was it being done? At the heart of the AKP are two things. There's a corporatist authoritarianism that is like that. People say, oh, they're Islamists, they're Islamists, they're Islamists. Actually, no. The ban on alcohol that was all over the Daily Mail, you know what it was? It was a ban on selling alcohol at motorway service stops, which seems like a fairly good idea to me. The second thing they were attacked for was basically, they were depicted in the Daily Mail as requiring women to wear the veil. Actually, no. What they did do was reverse a law that was brought in by the military that said no woman, and this is in a predominantly Muslim country, is allowed to wear the veil at a university, at a hospital as a doctor, as a professional. That law was stripped off the books by Erdogan, and it was a progressive move to strip it off the books. It was depicted here as basically in the most Islamophobic terms. So you're dealing with a very, very, very complex situation of understanding a regime which had delivered real change, but also demonstrated an incredibly authoritarian streak which had gone on and preceded it in terms of the history of Turkish politics. So Gezi Park resulted in the protest around the building of this shopping mall spread like wildfire to 80 cities across Turkey. At one stage, 3.5 million people were involved in that protest. It was huge. Some of the most violent protests around Gezi Park were not in Gezi Park. They were in Ankara, they were in southeastern Turkey, they were in cities that never made the media because the media only cared about what was easily accessible, and that was Gezi Park. The second thing that happened was Soma, the Soma mine disaster, which was 313 people, 301 were killed in Soma. Basically, Soma was a mine where a year earlier, this was in the 13th of May 2014, a year earlier that mine had been on strike. It's one of the largest mines in Turkey. A year earlier it had been on strike. The workers had been demanding improved conditions for health and safety. They'd actually been demanding that the state agency responsible for health and safety actually inspect, which they had not done. A number were fired and they were basically forced back to work. When Soma took place, 301 people essentially burned to death. The government didn't attend, no government minister attended for 5 days. The government passed a law to say it is illegal for any member of the government to be prosecuted for the events at Soma. This sent shockwaves through the labour movement within Turkey, and the marches in solidarity with Soma were absolutely immense. So between Gezi Park, Soma, and the collapsing Turkish economy, what you saw is growth rates going from 9.2, 9.3% down to 1.2%, and the Turkish lira declining about 40% within 18 months. In that context, the right wing, the MHP, who basically, MHP and CHP, predominantly led by the MHP, who are basically fascists, who came out and started vociferously opposing any peace agreement with the Kurds. This became the lightning rod. They were running from the right against any negotiated peace settlement. In June of this year, the HDP, who is a pro-Kurdish leftist party, who had actually managed to, for the first time, win 13.1% of the vote and break through a rule that had been put in place by the military that nobody who gets less than 10% can have any seats in the Turkish parliament. The AKP lost their majority. So basically, they were reduced to the status of a minority party within the Turkish National Assembly. Between the period of them losing in June and the next election in November, what you saw was a massive escalation in violence by the Turkish state against Kurdistan. A huge escalation in violence, to the stage where 3,000 people will have died by the end of December. Absolutely massive escalation, with a dual purpose. One, make it as difficult as possible for people in Kurdistan and all of southeast Turkey to show up to vote. Second, send a message of basically only a strong, firm, hard government can see us through this period of terror. Thirdly, was the discussions of terror on the border, of basically Syria. Only we can protect you from the issues, the threat that is posed by the instability within Turkey, within Kurdistan and within Syria. So it was very much played to an authoritarian position. Now, I'm going to touch on two things briefly to do with Turkey's relationship with Syria. And I think these are incredibly important because there are some very, very simplistic depictions that go around, depending on which way is the wind blowing, around Turkey's role with Syria. There are two main accusations that are levelled at the AKP. Firstly, that they have shipped arms to Daesh. And that's based on two sets of vehicles that were intercepted by basically local officials under judicial order of the local level in the Adana province going to the border, which initially it broke that there were reports that they were carrying armaments, that the shipments were allegedly going to Daesh. The army generals, basically the squaddies, who undertook the seizure of the goods, the judge investigating and the journalist responsible for initially leaking the story have all been jailed. Because the MIT is basically above criticism, and to disclose this was disclosing the national secret. So under national secrecy laws, it is impossible to find out. No one in Turkey actually knows, other than people who are in jail or people who authorise those shipments. The Turkish position is basically, the Turkish government position when it has come out and said anything, is that they were going to Turkmen militia. Turkey has openly acknowledged it supports 10 Turkmen militia who are fighting in Syria, and have been fighting in Syria for a long time. There's a historic relationship that goes back many, many, many years with the Turkmen community. These are Turkish-speaking people who live in the border regions of Syria. That's the official position. Anybody who tells you that they've got superb evidence that can prove that there are massive arms shipments that went into Syria to Daesh is, frankly, I don't know where they're getting it from. That does not mean arms did not get to Daesh, because as you know, many of the arms actually were originally American supplied to troops in Iraq. To forces in Iraq, seized when army bases were taken over. So where those eventually ended up, who knows? The second question is the question of oil, and this is the most annoying question. The question of oil, implicit is the notion that basically Turkey is secretly buying shed loads of oil from Syria, from Daesh-controlled refineries and wells. If you actually go into the detail and look at the level of oil production that is taking place under Daesh-controlled facilities that haven't been destroyed, and many have, it is at between 10 and 15% of normal production. At the height of the Turkish economic boom, at the height of it, before Daesh, 27% of Turkey's oil came from Syrian wells, was shipped in. Most of that infrastructure has been destroyed, but if you go into the detail of where it goes, how it's shipped, you will find that there is an incredibly large network of many Kurdish middlemen who trade in oil. They trade in oil. They've traded in oil for donkey's years. They've traded in oil since way before Daesh. And most of the supply, from most of the information that's available, is actually going to where? Combination of places. It's actually going to Peshmerga. It's purchased by Peshmerga. It's actually going to Damascus. Damascus even has a mafia-like deal where its refineries process some of the oil, and it's actually going into Turkey, but it can't go into Turkey directly in massive pipelines. What it is, it's smuggled under the border. It's smuggled in tankers with bribery at the border. So yes, it makes it into Turkey. It's an infinitesimally small amount of oil that gets there, and frankly, it's been raised as this massive issue, and the implicit link that's there is basically dodgy Islamic regime backing dodgy right-wing militias, and that's pernicious. It plays into a very wrong-headed stereotype, and it needs taking apart. It needs basically people doing the legwork, doing the analysis to be able to say, actually, it's more complicated than that. It's not as simple as that. And basically it paints a whole slew of people as angelic and another set as potentially as basically devils. The situation on the ground is way more complicated. I wish I had longer to go on, but I'm going to stop.
Who would like to speak first?
I can. So the question on military intervention, I think there are a couple of points, and especially in relation to ground troops. I think again, we need to understand that all these things are already happening, and I think that's also what the point of a lot of people who have been involved with politics in the Middle East or in Syria itself. Like they have been Republican Guard of Iran, Hezbollah, different factions. So they are already sort of ground troops. So what we're basically talking about is particular ground troops from particular actors like the United States and Britain. I think that's what we talk about. And I think that what you need to think about is the terrible consequences of what all these military interventions from all these different angles have already caused Syria. It's so painful. This is a country that is part of our history, it's part of our identity. It's Damascus, like Iraq was. This is the root of Arab poetry, science, amazing science. I mean, it's first and foremost an incredibly painful tragedy that all these different interventions have caused so much disastrous consequences. The second thing is the interventions from different sides, because Syria is such a proxy state. It's really the site of a proxy war between different levels of imperialism. Imperialism, intra-imperialism, inter-imperialism, all these different levels of intervention. That also results in a very painful division among peoples in the region, where in 2006 people were proudly saying that Syrians were hosting Lebanese who were fleeing from South Lebanon during the Israeli bombardments. Now the discourse is the reverse. Now the discourse is bitter, it's resentful, it's like what we all did for everyone, and now what we get in return is you send us fighters, you send us people to kill it. So it has also created a huge bitter division among people. We are going to take a long time before we get over that. The second point is I think you just need to look at the motives of intervention. That will give you a lot of answers. What are the motives of the people who are talking about intervention? Now, you don't need to be Einstein to just deconstruct what Cameron is saying, what Obama is saying. Motives often will tell you a lot about what consequences will be. And obviously we have unfortunately too many examples. We have too many examples as recent as 2003, 4, 5 of what military interventions do. So I think, I mean, good or not good, now we are in a context where actually that is enough. To just look at the motives is enough to tell us a lot about what. It's not like maybe, like some people during the debate about intervention in Kosovo or Afghanistan, well, maybe it helps, but this is so different, but this is an exception. It's because they hadn't seen something that similar in, I think, 2 or 3 decades. But now we have too many examples, so we don't need to guess like what the ramifications will be. The third point about that is, I think, that question of intervention is, I think it's testimony of the confusion of the left. It's a shame for me that it has become the litmus test it's the beginning and the end of a debate. It's really a shame. I think it's very good and important that people like you ask these questions, because there's a lot of confusing and allows us to answer it. But it's a shame that it has become such a crucial issue for political parties and groups and writers. Why can't we start from the point of, yes, anti-imperialist critique is important, but it also always relates to international solidarity. You cannot have one without the other. You cannot erase a hugely important, rich dynamic of what erupted in 2011, from which we can learn a lot, by the way, and we're not. We can learn a lot from the activities and strategies and tactics that Syrians, and for that matter Egyptians and Moroccans, etc. have developed. We can learn from that here in our movements, in our confrontations with the state and police. That's completely absent. Why can't we start from solidarity and internationalism? Aren't they supposed to be one of the two core issues of our politics? I think it's very telling for me that I interviewed 7 people, about 7 or 8 people in Lebanon and Syria for piece I'm writing, because I got so dismayed by the debate and this almost split tone, a splitting tone almost among comrades, like, how can you sign your name on this article in the paper, how dare you not go to this demo? I thought it was really bizarre. And so what I did was, I thought, why don't we just ask some of the fucking people there? Why are you inventing the wheel? Why don't you just ask comrades, leftist Marxists who don't need to be taught about anti-imperialism. They know very well firsthand what the consequences are. So some of the answers were really painful. I mean, some of them were saying intervention, military intervention, this is a theoretical question, man. This is an academic question. It's already happening on our roofs. What are you talking about? And the other thing also what I learned a lot from was how positionality is so important. Yes, you can theoretically have a strategy, but my God, what a different position you are in when your livelihood is gone and you have tried everything else. And then to come with an almost moralistic tone about, but first and foremost, declare where you stand in terms of intervention. I think we really underestimate how we can come across. I've been like that. I can reread myself being like that, yeah, but what's your point on intervention? And I remember how I must have come across by not asking what is going on with your family, or what is your city, what is the situation in Aleppo, or, like I see, so we're sort of in the middle of learning all these things. Now it seems for the first time, and I really think the left should get its act together. I think that to be so divisive about something like intervention, where there are solutions, we can have debates, we can have exchanges, we can write letters, we can have forums, we can share ideas. Why let this divide us? I think that's a shame. I would really think it's a shame to see that it's either stop the war as it is or nothing at all. I think we are better. We are better at that. The other thing that I also want to say in that regard is that for a lot of people who are not part of the organized left, there's a very different dynamic. I was actually really positively surprised in the summer. Hundreds and thousands of people, they didn't wait for our statements or our analysis. They were organizing solidarity with refugees. Hundreds and thousands of people have a common sense response to the violence of Assad. They're completely against it. They have a common sense response to Daesh, and we are debating whether Daesh is maybe also anti-imperialist, maybe it also has some kind of revolutionary connotations. It's very odd for me how distant we have become from the sort of common sense judgment and knowledge, I would say, of a lot of people. And I think that also one element is, I think, very important in that, is that our algorithms are still sort of stuck or behind the sort of strategy and tactics we've developed during the Iraq War. I think we still think in those lines, and also in terms of what it means to engage with people who already have a voice, experience, history. For us it was difficult to do that 10 years ago because we didn't have any friends or groups in Iraq. It was decimated by years of sanctions and by Saddam Hussein. Now we have people, we have friends, we have internet, we have seen these people do things in 2011. There are direct links. So I think we are relearning how to bring that part of the dynamic also in our own understandings. And so we are unlearning some of the strategies that we have sort of adopted during the anti-war ways of organizing in the context of Iraq. And I think we are also doing something else, and this is very important. And this is also very personal for me. I mean, Britain is slightly different because the presence of Caribbean people from India, Pakistan has been a little longer than continental Europe. But I think what we're also seeing is a historical moment of a coincidence of all these big debates and actually a new generation of non-white people coming up and asking questions about, so what is my say in this exactly? This is what you see in Holland very clearly, and in France and in Belgium, where the confrontations with the state, what it means to be secular, what it means to be democratic, what it means to be one man, one vote. Actually, when shit hits the fan, it doesn't count. You are different, you are othered. And I think this is also happening in the movement. I think a lot of people who are coming partly from the part of the world that they are organically seen as their home, they are sort of confused when they are being told, no, the main enemy is at home. So when you say to me, or to a Syrian, or to a Lebanese, who you've tried to recruit in your movement, because you need to have non-white people in your movement, right? Because that's a real progressive movement. When you say to them, no, the real enemy is at home, it's really painful. It's like saying you only have one home. We can't adopt your ideas about our strategies into our way of thinking. So I think we're also dealing with this confrontation where we're not sure yet what place do we give it. Do we keep saying the real enemy is at home, we can only comment on Cameron and the Tories, or do we say actually, yeah, we need to rethink this way of talking and these terminologies into sort of reality where London, Amsterdam, Paris are full of people with thousands of different homes. So I think that's important also to take with you, and because the consequence is what I've seen a lot, and that's the answer to the question. Why is the movement much more white now? It's not identity politics. I think it's very disgraceful when people come with identity politics as an answer. I think it's how do you put it? It's patronizing. It's like, oh, you're sort of falling in the trap of your singular identity. No, there's a legitimate critique, like the gentleman said. You need to listen to this. The fact that you don't have as many active young people, organizers on the ground, it should be a warning. You should ask yourself why. You can't just explain it away by saying, yeah, well, we lost the war in Iraq, and that's why. No, it has partly to do with the fact that a lot of thousands of people don't see their concerns and arguments reflected in the choices you make, in the kind of people you invite on your platforms. Those are very genuine, critical questions. You need to engage with it. You can't say, I've heard it so many times, identity politics, we shouldn't fall in this trap, you know, we had it with the feminist movement. It's really people don't understand how insulting it is, and it is insulting because people like me and others, we have temporarily removed ourselves from the movement to protect ourselves. Like, if these are the answers you're being given by comrades, you take this, and I think that's important to understand. There's a new group of people who want to have a say also in how you define your theories about imperialism and your strategies, and I think now is the time to engage with that.
With basically Iraqi Kurdistan and Turkey. In fact, just this week there's been a very high-level meeting taking place in Istanbul, and to be honest, there's been a fairly strong relationship built between Ankara and Iraqi Kurdistan, predominantly on oil and the pipeline that goes through, but there's also strong commercial relationships. As you know, the Iraqi area of Kurdistan is one of the most economically developed. It's grown very, very quickly and trades extensively with Turkey. So you've got almost a good Kurd, bad Kurd thing in the way in which it's depicted inside of Turkish politics. And often the rhetoric you'll pick up, especially from the nationalist parties, will use the absolute crudest anti-Kurd racism. I mean, and it cuts across everywhere. Except, you will also see large corporations actually willing to enter into deals with Iraqi Kurdistan all the time. The situation is very different with the PKK. It's also a lot more complicated than people assume. Key to the AKP getting its vote back was actually making further inroads in Kurdistan. It has a small base within Kurdistan. It's not, because you have got a layer, this is not a monolithic community. You have got a layer of small to medium-sized businesses within Kurdistan who've done quite well, and who the government has consciously fostered connections with. And in this sense, Merkel actually gave Erdogan a major gift when she visited. When she basically visited immediately before the November elections. Firstly, it was basically seen as European recognition. Turkey's been trying to get into the EU for a long time. It was a prestige issue that was played upon. But secondly, what did she say? It basically talks about the level of aid that would go to Turkey. Where do you think most Syrian refugees end up in Turkey? They end up in the large cities, but where do they start? They start off in Kurdish lands on the border. They start off in southeastern Turkey. And it's the municipalities, who are often Kurdish-controlled municipalities, who are basically paying for these, paying and assisting, and actually placing people in their own homes. And it's just as Miriyam was saying, that there is one of the sad things to see has been the shift after the Suruç bombing, after the Ankara bombing, in the openness that people had. You had an absolutely amazing level of openness of people opening their own homes to take in, 2.3 million Syrian refugees have basically ended up, they're technically called displaced persons, in order to basically not allow them to work. I mean, that's a major legal and political problem within Turkey itself. But you're also seeing the start of that to shift, the start of it to become more people susceptible to the politics of fear, more people susceptible to the politics of division. The money that's coming through from the EU will be, some of that money will end up in basically Kurdish-controlled organisations and municipalities, and so it also helps the AKP shore up an element of its base. So it's a complex relationship. Is the PKK going to be defeated? No, the PKK won't be defeated. The war will drag on and on and on. I mean, at some stage there will have to be a negotiated settlement, because I think pretty much even across the right of the political spectrum, sections of the CHP also would acknowledge privately that there needs to be a negotiated settlement. The complexity of it is basically that there is starting to be a fragmentation in the PKK leadership, and it's also not true that the HDP are on exactly the same page as the PKK leadership, or that Öcalan is on the same page as the HDP. So you've got a fragmentation going on within Turkish politics, and increasingly the government is quietly still in discussions with Öcalan in prison, whilst at war with the PKK. So you've got this very, very complex situation going on. Is the HDP over? No, I don't believe the HDP is over. One of the good things that came out of Gezi and Soma and all of the movements that went on there was they broke through that they could only gain alliances with a tiny, tiny number of people on the borders of Kurdistan. What they did was break through into the big cities. They broke through into areas which were not Kurdish dominated. They got voted for in areas they got voted for by Alevis, they got voted for by Christians, they got voted for by Muslims. They broke through not only the 10% barrier, which was psychological because of military rule, they broke through in terms of being able to bridge to a secular democratic left inside of the big cities, inside of Ankara, inside of Istanbul, which creates a really interesting discussion, because the platform that was privately being run on in more conservative areas of rural Kurdistan was not the same platform. If you could actually read Turkish, you would see. In the big cities, it basically campaigned on a pro-gay rights ticket, campaigned on a restoration of trade union rights, campaigned very heavily on Soma. That was toned down in some of the smaller, more rural centres. So it's a complex relationship. The HDP isn't going anywhere, despite the fact that 2 weeks ago, they actually tried to assassinate the leader. Thankfully, he's got bulletproof glass. So he's not going anywhere. The HDP is not going anywhere. And I do want to pick up on a point Miriyam had made, which is about the relationship between where we work and how we engage with people. And I'll tell you a story. The HDP held, this is a poster from an HDP meeting that took place just before the Turkish elections in November. They were under siege at the time. Basically all main rallies in Kurdistan and southeastern Turkey were cancelled. The party cancelled them, well, because they'd had the Suruç bombing, which was a rally, and they had the Ankara bombing, which was a rally. So basically they took a rather rational decision to cancel all major rallies. And so Demirtas actually came to Wood Green, Tottenham, spoke to two crowds of 3,000 people each, packed out, absolutely packed out. These are people who work in the community I live in, the people who live on my street, the people we engage with. And so the notion that there's an abstract position that we take on the situation in Turkey, the abstract position we take on the situation with the HDP, it is not abstract to the people who work in your school, or even, frankly, my friends at the top of the road, in the corner store. They had HDP posters up. I mean, they often have PKK flags up as well, but it's that sort of shop. So it's very much a dialogue. And you know, it was actually sad that there was about maybe 3 or 4 other lefties that I spotted there that I knew from the London left. That is the sort of thing we need to engage with. It's not easy to unpick all the detail of the politics of Turkey, and no one can unpick all the details of the politics of everywhere in the world, but that's the community I live in, so I'm engaged in it. I fell for identity politics. I'm the worst accent ever. So, final point. You had a long question about basically the nature of the state within Turkey. Is it Nasserite? Is it... the closest analogy I can come up with is, well, there's an analogy to basically the early post-military state in Brazil and the pre in Mexico. So there's an element of basically you have a layer of independent unions and you have a layer of essentially corporatism. So you've got basically state-supported, state-funded unions, an element of both. That said, it's increasingly been leaning towards more and more free market emphasis. It's nowhere near as state-heavy as it was 10 years ago. Mass privatisations have been the norm. Massive mega expenditures on construction. And one of the fascinating things has been the creation of basically a new social base by huge levels of investment of previously people who were excluded. Like, you have to remember, under the military and under the period prior to the military, you had a very distinct social layering within Turkey. And part of that was the rule of the White Turks. People don't like talking about this, but this is true. You had a dominant caste, a dominant layer of predominantly urban, highly educated, often secular, often wealthy business people. What this has led to, the AKP is a fascinating experiment, because you've got, if you listen to the debates, you've got a layer of people who became newly wealthy under the AKP, and a social layer, a new emergent middle class, that have got very direct relationships to the AKP. And some of this has come out in corruption investigations, but it's a complex social relationship. So it's hard to draw an exact parallel. Is it analogous to Nasser? It's basically post-military Brazil is the closest, or pre in Mexico. And so those are those. Final point, the relationship between the authoritarian aspects of the Turkish state and how it maintains support even in the context of war is because there's a direct relationship between the external racism that Turks and Kurds face in London, in Germany, in Paris. That goes back like wildfire. Every time that a Turk is killed in Germany, it is on the news all over Turkish TV. It's in every newspaper, and it is used both for good and bad. It plays to a sense of the need for defensiveness, for a strong man to defend us, to restore self-esteem. And the absence of self-esteem plays a role in how that is strengthened and marketed. So the discussion in the UK press and in a lot of the debate around refugees, people in Turkey, a lot of my friends in Turkey, were basically, my family were saying, this is bullshit. Britain is taking in 20,000 and we are being lectured for not doing enough. And that plays into the sense of we're just being fucked over royally, and we need somebody who's willing to stand up and fight back. If you want to understand where the authoritarian aspect comes from, it comes from a history that involves the military and politics, but it also comes from a reaction.
Okay, I'll try and answer the questions. I'll deal with the ones that won't be time to deal with anything beyond France.
Sorry.
I think the question about France's history of migration and deindustrialisation and so on, there have been lots of arguments put over the years about what is the economic or social factor that has given rise to the FN, as if there is a demand coming for those kind of politics. So you've had all kinds of maps drawn that will show in the first electoral breakthrough, they showed, you know, European settlers from Algeria and the vote for the FN. Then it was presence of immigrants and the vote for the FN. Then it was absence of immigrants and the vote for the FN. Then it was, you know, now there's an argument about peri-urban fringes, and these are the people who are most likely to vote for the FN. And I don't think that any of those explanations are satisfactory as an explanation for why does the Front National exist and why has it been so durable. To give an example, there was, I mean, first of all, in terms of the history of immigration, France's history of immigration, it kind of France has a record of immigration that surpasses any other European country, pretty much, in terms of the numbers of people who've come to France since the late 19th century. In 1968, people were asked, there were polls that said that they're trying to test opinion towards Arabs. 66%, something like that, of people interviewed said there are too many Arabs in France. You didn't have a far-right movement. The far-right, in fact, found it very difficult to grow and very difficult. Le Pen himself was criticised in his own party for focusing on immigration because people said, well, people will think we're racist, it will block us getting votes. In the mid-80s, when the Front National had broken through, a similar proportion said there are too many Arabs. The difference was you had a party that had broken into the mainstream that legitimised those views. So you can have, people can hold racist views in a latent way, but feel ashamed about expressing them. And it becomes a political construct. You know, the arguments about, all the arguments about unemployment and immigration and so on, you know, the FN was saying from the mid-70s, 1 million unemployed is 1 million immigrants too many, then it became 2 million, then 3 million, then 4 million. But it required a party to be there to make that link for people to think, oh, maybe there's a problem about immigration. And that's why academics went off and looked at the proportion of immigrants in an area as if that was somehow, as if there really was a relationship between the two, and there wasn't. So I think that was the first thing, that there is these things are politically constructed, and therefore there's a battle to be had over that. And one of the things they did, one of the things they were able to do, was to shift their rhetoric from a rhetoric based around notions of white supremacy or racial superiority to an emphasis on culture. So they used to send out memos to their members saying, don't argue blacks out, argue, let's organise the progressive repatriation of immigrants. And so Islamophobia fitted absolutely with that shift. It allowed people to be racist without being accused of being racist, because they were saying, we've got a problem with Islam because Muslims are homophobic, or they're sexist, or they're... So you could... And crucially, it dovetailed with attitudes on the left towards secularism, which disarmed the left when it came to the major battles over the hijab in particular, and has been a real obstacle in the building of a radical left, because the French working class, because of that history of immigration, is incredibly diverse, and so you can't build a radical left movement without addressing politically those issues. It's not enough just to put up a red flag and say we're the alternative to the FN, as so many different organisations have discovered. So thankfully, people aren't waiting for the radical left to organise meetings against war and against Islamophobia. People, those two big meetings, the one last week and the one in March, weren't there were activists from the radical left involved in it, but not their organisations themselves. Now, that means you can have initiatives that can get a significant audience. What we've found, though, in Britain, is when it comes to building something that is consistent and sustained and rooted, it needs more than just an umbrella initiative and a coalition that comes together at elections. You have to have some form of organisation. And in order to do that, it means two things that appear contradictory. You need to have organisation that is rooted in workplaces and colleges and wider society that provides an umbrella and unity for radical left activists, but you also at times need political clarity and sharpness, and not to be afraid of having arguments in order to determine what is going to be your course of action. What are the priorities you're going to identify? And so that has been the difficulty of the radical left. It's not been a problem of a lack of struggle. There've been absolutely incredible struggles in France. 20 years ago, there was a massive public sector wave of struggle involving postal workers, energy workers, teachers that swept the Juppé government that had just been elected aside, really, that made him a complete lame duck and put the question of class struggle back on the agenda for more than a decade. And there were successive struggles that developed a very high level of organisation. But the questions that kept coming back are, what do you do after a struggle? What do you do after an election? How do you organise day to day on the ground? And that has to be around a set of politics. So I think that the last thing is, I'm always a bit wary in these discussions that it ends up with, if only the French left wasn't so shit on these questions, everything would be all right. And you look at some of the examples of what's happened in France with the reaction to the Charlie Hebdo attacks and these latest attacks, where you've had school children hauled before the police and the courts, accused of apology for terrorism. There was somebody sentenced today to 2 years in prison, 18 years old, I think, for shouting Allahu Akbar 3 times to a policeman. You've got, so you look at all these cases, isn't this terrible? But exactly those kind of things are happening all the time, every week, in Britain as well. There are exactly the same cases of school kids being taken through Channel or Prevent, vast majority of them Muslim. That also, so in other words, it's not enough for us to say, oh, if only the French left got its act together on this. There are imperatives for us as well to be organised around, and I would say in these terms, it's not just organising against the war, but that is very important that we have a strong anti-war movement and that people across the world see that there is mass opposition to war in Britain, and that we don't let those differences divide us and prevent us from organising successful anti-war mobilisations. But it's also organising in our workplaces and in schools and colleges to stop the Prevent agenda, which is the thin end of a wedge, which is about the demonisation of Muslims in Britain. And there's nothing to say that what happens in France and the terrible situation that we've arrived at in France, that Britain is somehow immune from that.